Welcome to the SRS Podcast. I'm your host, Aaron J. Babyar, and I'm the Director of Support Raising Solutions. Whether you are a new ministry worker or a veteran looking to increase your competence and confidence, Support Raising Solutions seeks to bless you in your quest to be a spiritually healthy, vision-driven, and fully funded Great Commission worker. My guest today is a growing friend of mine. A lot of times I get to sit down with people that I've already known pretty well. But in this case, C and I have just started to get to know each other rather recently. And she serves on staff at a ministry that is involved with mobilization in a global fashion. We're going to use her name as C and C alone because there's a good possibility down the road a bit she could end up in a closed country. And we have a feeling that this particular podcast might be something that's good to keep out there for a long time. So just from a protection safety standpoint, we're just going to call you C. So C, welcome today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm glad you're here. Very glad you're here. We're recording today in a little makeshift studio in Northwest Arkansas. Mm-hmm. And as we've sat here and troubleshot all the equipment and technology, learning how to do all this, I've already become a little fascinated with some of your stories. So I want to just jump right into that and ask you, first of all, just to introduce yourself.
Okay.
With a little bit of your journey, into the missions work that you do, but specifically about your journey with raising your support, because you are someone who started as a single female that raised all of her full support, and yet over time you met a handsome young gentleman who was also raised and was living off support, and you guys merged all that. So I think there's a story within that people would love to hear.
Sure. I started support raising in 2010. I was involved in a campus ministry and decided to move overseas to a closed country.
Okay.
So I went to an SRS boot camp, actually, and learned about support raising, learned about developing lists and calling people, and I followed what I learned in the boot camp and was fully funded. I launched after 4 months of support raising to the closed country, and I lived there for 6 years.
Okay. Quick question. If you recall, how much did you need to raise at that time that you raised in 4 months? And I'm assuming this was mostly some regular monthly gift. And then, of course, there's some special gifts. But do you recall how much you needed to raise at that time?
I believe it was around $3,200 a month.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
So I launched to the country. Actually, in my first 9 months on staff overseas, I lost $700 a month in support.
Wow.
And none of it was anything to do with me, the ministry. There were a series of unfortunate things that happened in my ministry partners' lives, and some of them were health related, some were job related. But every month I had people emailing me telling me they had to come off my team.
So you lost about a quarter of your support, financially at least, in the first, did you say 9 months?
The first 9 months.
Wow, okay.
And the schedule was for me to be there 2 years straight before I came back to the U.S. And so thankfully I had built up a buffer in my ministry account.
Okay, good.
So that could carry me through. So you had a healthy reserve
fund. Do you recall how much that was? I'm curious.
I think it was around $15,000 or $20,000.
Okay, all right. That is a common question we get: is how much of a reserve fund do we need? And there's not an easy answer. So in your context, you had $15,000 to $20,000 of reserve fund.
Yes, and my goal while I was overseas was to never have below $10,000 in that account, and that was a personal goal. That wasn't a ministry. My ministry didn't.
No one dictated that
told
to you?
me to do that. No.
Okay.
And so in that first 2 years, the last 6 months were really tight financially. But I came home, again, repeated what I had done in boot camp. I made calls, I had appointments, got fully funded again, relaunched overseas, and have been fully funded since.
Right.
And that was 8 years ago. I moved back to the U.S. in the fall of 2017.
Okay, so you were living overseas for 6, close to 7 years as a fully funded single adult who had raised her full support in the U.S. You lost some, but then you came back and raised some more at some point. And then, so you ended up staying in that closed country, living overseas for quite a period of time, correct?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm just trying to put all the pieces together.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of times people are wondering little details like that. So please continue with what's happened more recently.
Okay. So when I came back to the U.S., I was looking at different ministries. I ended up coming on staff with this mobilization ministry as a staff support coach.
Okay.
So I work with the HR team, and I also help out with member care for our staff. Mm-hmm. But the large majority of my time is spent getting reports from our staff ladies that are raising their funds and meeting with them to help them think through support raising.
Right. So within all that, just to put a little finer point on it, what I hear is a job change. Now, you continue to work for a mobilization ministry, but whereas one point you were living overseas in a closed country, you moved back to the United States and moved into a role at HQ, so to speak, and we're helping others and continue to be helping others with raising their support. So you're coaching. And so I think one of the questions that it's got to be there is, what about your supporters? Did your supporters think, oh, well, she's not really a missionary anymore? Or how did you address that? Or did people say rude things or ask hard questions? Or did you get in front of the 8 ball on that one and address that headlong? Tell us a little bit about that.
I did have to transfer support from one ministry to another. Okay. And it wasn't a seamless process. There was no easy way to do it except to call each of my ministry partners and ask them to transfer.
Oh, so you had an organization change as well, correct?
I did,
okay.
Yes.
Okay. And for those listening that might be outside the United States context, we have what's called a 501c3 nonprofit here. And within the U.S. at least, they handle your giving comes through that. It's a way the government can track for the sake of taxes and a number of other reasons. But when you change organizations, your supporters must also change the destination where they send their funds. And that's not always a seamless process, because it's at that point, usually it's become easy for people to do their normal gift. And all of a sudden you're kind of interrupting their easy and asking them to make some changes. And it's not uncommon for that to be difficult. It's not uncommon to be able to keep most of your supporters, but rarely have I heard of somebody that had zero problems and everybody just stayed with and made an increase and all that kind of stuff. And so you walked through that process.
So I made calls to each one of my prayer and financial supporters who had been with me while I was overseas and explained to them that I was moving back to the U.S. I was coming on staff with a different organization, and that I wanted to explain to them what my new job was going to be.
Okay. So you didn't just send an email to everybody?
I did not.
Praise the Lord. Okay.
I talked for about an hour with each of them. There was no possible way I could sit down face to face in the amount of time that I had to get my funds transferred and to make sure I was fully funded to start work. Okay. So, and I have a good relationship with my prayer and financial partners. Okay.
Because you've been intentional about that.
I have been intentional, okay. Yes. Right. I send out monthly newsletters. Each year at Christmas would connect with them. So every time I would come home, I would meet with them. So,
and probably some personal touches in between, Facebook or a text here and there, or an email that's not just a form letter, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So I had good relationships. It wasn't a strain on the relationship for me to just call them and explain what was happening.
Great.
Most people were supportive and even excited about my new role.
Yeah.
I did have, I think, 2 families who said, you were the last person that we were giving to their ministry that was overseas. Now, everyone else that we've been giving to is stateside, and we really do want to be giving to someone who's on the field overseas, which I completely understand.
Sure, yeah.
So they actually did come off my team. But it was on good terms.
Okay. And there wasn't it was love and now it's hate relationship. Right. It was more of an understanding of, hey, thanks for your partnership. I get it. Right. Bless some other people that are overseas.
Right. Yeah. And I wanted them to, I do think a lot of times people feel guilty if they have to come off your team. And I don't want anybody to ever feel guilty giving somewhere else. That's fine. And I fully believe that God will provide for me also. And so we made the transition. I had about 70% of my support transfer to my new organization.
Okay.
And then at that point, it was clear that I needed to start raising new funds.
So 70% is not 100%?
It is not 100%.
I joke because, unfortunately, I just had a conversation with somebody like that this week who their quote unquote goals had been adjusted to what they had coming in, not to what their vision was. And it was a peaceful yet kind of tough conversation where I had to encourage them to be honest with what their actual need was. And in that person's case, they were only about at 80% of what they really needed to be able to have their ministry and their family both thrive. So you were in a similar case. You were at 70 of the 100 that you needed.
I was, and I do know that that's a common thing, that people adjust their goals to fit where their funds are. And I also know that produces stress financially.
Sure.
And
more than just financial stress sometimes, right?
Yes. But coming home from the field, I knew there were natural stressors that come when you transition in life, and making a major transition from overseas back to the U.S. Can be extremely stressful.
Yeah.
So any way that I could not add stress to my new role was a goal of mine.
Yeah, good.
So I proceeded to try to raise new funds. But when you're out of the country for 6 years, you don't meet that many new people, as you can imagine. And so I went back to my home church, community groups that I had been involved with. But those people, even though they do still know me, they weren't new to me. They're people I had asked before or were already on my team.
Sure.
And when I say ask before, I don't think it's bad to ask people again.
No.
But there are people who I, at that moment, couldn't ask again. So it kind of was from scratch. It was people that I had met since I moved home. So maybe I had known them for 2 or 3 months. And I was asking them to meet with me, to partner with me.
Sure.
In this new ministry that most of them had never heard of. Most of the people I met with have never heard of mobilization.
Right.
They've never heard of monthly support.
Right, yeah.
And so it really was a pioneering effort in fundraising, which I actually did it in November and December of 2017.
Okay.
I've also never raised funds in that time of year.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Every time I would come home for furloughs, it was in the spring or early summer. And so it was a new experience in that way, because people are very busy in November and December.
And I found even if they're not, they think they are.
Right. Yes. Everyone is always busier than they think.
I had to look at Christmas lights again, really.
Yes. Yeah. And so it was difficult. It's not impossible. I am fully funded.
Right. Okay. So real quick there. So I get the feeling that you did raise your full support that you needed to. So that last 30%, right? And how much was that you had to raise over, that you said you did in about 2 months' time?
Just under $1,500.
Okay, great. All right. Thank you.
Hey, I just want to take a few seconds to mention something. Outside of the Bible, the book I most frequently recommend to Great Commission-focused leaders is The God Ask by Steve Shadrach. I'm humbled to say that Steve is a friend of mine who actually helped pioneer support-raising solutions. And if you haven't read his book, you're missing out. Instead of going into a support-raising appointment fearing what people might say, you can have confidence that God is superintending the whole process. This book will help you embrace the fact that biblical support raising is not a man ask. No, it's actually a God ask. And it's available at cmmpress.org, where you can receive a 10% discount if you use the code SRSPodcast.
Tell us a little bit about your husband and about him and his process and his support raising, because I know you said that he didn't grow up in the U.S., but he was fully funded prior to you guys even connecting.
Yes. So my husband did not grow up in the U.S. He came to Austin, Texas when he was 19 for a job. He worked in the IT industry. And after a couple of years of work, he went to UT in Austin. And while he was there, he met a campus ministry worker who told him about God's heart for the world and unreached people groups and mobilization, actually. So he started learning more about that, decided he wanted to move overseas. So as an international student in the U.S., he began fundraising. And he did not have a large pool of people to go to.
Yeah, because he wasn't from there, right?
Right. So he actually, he's told me about his journey in fundraising.
Mm-hmm.
He was in his 4th generation of referrals.
Wow.
Before he reached 100% of his monthly support.
That's a man that will stay after something until it's done right there.
Yes,
That's
he's
a good
very
sign.
persistent.
Very well.
He is very persistent. And so he told me he was on an appointment with a girl asking her to join his team, and she said, "So how did you get my number?" And he said, "Well, I got your number from this person who I actually met through this other person who I met through this person that I knew from college."
Wow.
And it's just a really encouraging testimony to God's provision for him. And I think a lot of times people look at fundraising and think, I can't do that because I don't know enough people, or
Right.
people are telling me no, and I don't know anyone else.
Right.
And I think it's really just cool how God continued to provide people for him. And he did reach 100% of his support.
Well, you and I are going to definitely have to record a different podcast just about that process of doing referrals, because that's awesome. So he was fully funded and you were fully funded. And then you guys began realizing that Jesus put you in each other's life for a reason, and you're going to be together and all that kind of stuff. And so I want to transition a little bit about your story now. And you're at that moment where you've realized we are getting married. This is till death do us part. Praise Jesus. He's got a team. I've got a team. How do we manage that? Are people going to leave one of our teams? Are we going to get everybody on both of our teams? How do I introduce my people to him and vice versa? Because these people are praying for each of us individually, and we got to merge this thing. So tell us about that. What happened there?
Well, we're still honestly in the process of merging.
Okay.
We were engaged for 2 months before we got married.
Okay.
So we had a very short engagement.
So you guys had courted for a while, and once you decided to get married, you said, let's just get married.
Yes.
Okay.
So our first step was to send out a newsletter saying, hey, we're married, and introduce one another to each other's people.
Right.
So it's been really good. We've had several responses to that newsletter saying, congratulations, we're so excited to meet one or the other. And the next step, because it's the end of the year, it's kind of a perfect time because we're working on end of the year asks.
Right.
And that's giving us more personal touches with our teams. And so we're writing them notes. We're getting ready to send them Christmas gifts.
Right.
And it's just a natural expectation that there's going to be interaction.
Right. So obviously you haven't said it, but I know that there is a concern, a strong concern that somebody might go, oh, well, he's married now. His support team can take care of her. When in reality, your expenses have probably gone up a bit, and you both, God willing, can keep most, if not all, of your team, and maybe even need to raise a little bit more because now you're dealing with stuff stateside that cost of living is higher than probably where each of you were. By the way, I first met your husband in Nairobi several years ago. So that man gets around.
He does.
But anyway, sometimes people will have a poor assumption that, oh, she doesn't need our support anymore. She's married. Or that can cut both ways. But boy, what are you doing specifically to combat that? So I know you said you did some notes and stuff like that, but I gotta imagine that's very much on your radar, and you're trying to make sure that that's not happening, particularly here because we're recording this towards the end of a calendar year.
Yes, we have been working as we were getting engaged and planning our wedding. We were communicating with our ministry partners that we're getting married. We work for the same organization. Nothing is changing for us as far as our jobs. So we would appreciate people to continue working with us and staying on our team. And it was more generalized, honestly, because it was such a quick season of trying to plan this wedding and get married. But we did try to communicate with people that we will be stateside for the next year with plans of moving overseas again.
Okay.
And most people were really excited. They wanted to hear more, but they told us, hey, let's talk after you get married.
Okay.
And we were like, that's great. We would love that.
Right.
So before about a month before our wedding, we did take a trip to Texas.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's where most of his support base is, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And we met with some of his supporters. We met with his home church and just explained that we're working together. Our expenses are going up. We actually just finalized our budget about 3 weeks ago.
Okay.
And so we are now planning to raise about $500 in monthly support.
Okay. So for the listeners, I just want to clarify a few different things. One is that as soon as C and her husband realized they were going to be getting married, even though it was a short engagement, they began a communication process with the people that were praying for and financially partnering with them. But then they didn't just send out a newsletter once and assume that it hit everybody. They continued that communication process and are to this day, having just been married a couple of months, and they're making sure that everybody that is partnering with them is aware of what's going on. And also they're inviting them, not telling them, of course, but inviting them to continue to partner with them in ministry. Meanwhile, usually what I have seen is most couples, when they get married, there's no longer a need for just both people's support if they're both individually fully funded, but there's a little bit more of a need because of the different costs involved in that. And so in your case, that's jumped to $500 more than what you both were currently having coming in support, which isn't a huge amount, and yet that's work. That's something that needs your focus, and that's kind of where you guys are at right now, correct?
Yes. And we haven't, I'm really thankful we haven't had anyone say kind of what you were talking about earlier, that his support team would take care of me, so there's no longer a need for my ministry partners to continue giving.
Right.
It seems like everyone is excited to partner with both of us as a couple. And we've even had people say to us, we're so excited to see how God uses your marriage in this work. And I think part of that is we know really great people, but also I think it's related to we both have strong relationships with our teams, and they both of our teams are really invested in our lives, and because we're invested in theirs.
Yeah. And with part of being spiritually healthy and vision driven and fully funded, that does involve vision driven communication. And even though for some people the marriage might have been a little bit of a surprise, like, wait, what? She's getting married? Like, wait, 8 weeks from now? Wait, what? Like that might have been a surprise. You had invested enough in the relationship with your people beforehand that when you gave them let's use that term again, vision-driven communication about what was next, it wasn't forget it. Whereas what I have talked with other people on kind of a more difficult side of things is when people have made some life changes and they haven't communicated very well, and there were assumptions out there that the missionary worker wasn't speaking to, and they lost people. They lost people because they just hoped that the people would keep giving instead of, vision casting and inviting that continued partnership.
I think that is one of I have also made that mistake of assuming that people would know something. And in my transition back from being overseas to stateside, I did have 3 families say to me, "Oh, we thought you weren't needing any support anymore, so we actually were going to give it to someone else." And I had to kind of backtrack and say, gosh, I'm sorry I didn't communicate that well. Here is what I'm doing. I completely understand if you can't be a part of my team anymore, and I really appreciate you guys. And I think 2 of them, one of them said, right now we can't, but please ask us in the future. And the other 2 stayed on my team for just a lower amount than they had been previously giving.
Right.
And part of that was I did assume that people would know I'm continuing on in ministry. And
kind of learned that the hard way, didn't you?
Yes, I did. But now I know that, and I tried my best to over communicate with people, because I know the reality is half of the people I send my newsletter to open it. And that doesn't mean they read it.
If half of them do, by the way, you might be a little bit above average.
It's usually about 50%, but that doesn't mean someone's reading it.
Right.
It could just be clicking over it. And because I know that, and I don't think I think people are just busy.
Yeah.
But I know that. And so I want to communicate more than just a newsletter. And so actually one of the things I've started doing, we did this yesterday. We had a day of prayer where we pray for our ministry and our ministry partner teams and anything else that's going on with our work. We spend time praying for that.
Good.
And I have started emailing people who are on my team and saying, hey, I prayed for you today individually.
Yeah.
It's
such a good practice to do that.
That's been really, they've been so encouraged by that. People respond and they start to tell me more things that are happening in their lives. And it's a really easy email to send. It's only a few sentences to say, hey, I prayed for you.
Yeah. I
hope you guys are doing well.
I know that you and your husband both have a lot of other work to do within the ministry context that you guys are currently in. And part of that too is because you are preparing to quite probably both move. Of course, you would be both because you're married now, but to move overseas again a year from now or so. But one of the things that I've appreciated about your attitude and your tone in all of this is, you mentioned that we need to raise about $500 more worth of support. You don't seem to have a bent that's somehow an interruption from the current ministry you're doing. It's more of it's a part of it. You're going to try and knock it out here at the time we're recording this. We're towards the end of a calendar year. You're going to try and knock that out. You don't seem intimidated by that. And it's going to be work and it might take you away from some of your quote unquote normal duties. And yet it's a part of, not a distraction from what you need to be doing. So I appreciate your attitude and all that and how you're approaching it. As we go to wrap this little podcast that's just kind of about your story and how God has brought two together as one, as spiritually healthy, vision-driven, fully funded missionaries. And any final words of advice you give to somebody who's approaching or in that season of life where they're going to get married, or they just got married and they have a support team, and whether their spouse is also a missionary, whether their spouse has a full-time vocational job anywhere in the world, what would you tell that person that they have a support team and now they're realizing, wow, I have some communication responsibilities? What would you advise?
I think it is really important to invest on the front end of your marriage in introducing your spouse to your ministry partners and meeting theirs, because in the future, it's really difficult to backtrack and say, oh, I didn't introduce you 3 years ago, but now we're moving here or doing this other thing. And there's just there's a distance in your relationship that could have been helped on the front end if you would invest the time. I know it's not easy. We do have a lot of things going on and trying to raise new funds, but I think that it is very, very important, because we are newlywed, that I'm taking the time to meet his people and he's taking time to meet mine, and we're doing our best to create unity with our team and with our ministry and build that vision, because I think that's going to carry over in the future rather than skimping on it now because we're really busy.
Right.
And I think that honors people. I think
For
that, we need to honor the people who are partnering with us.
Yeah.
And
if they're an afterthought, they're going to feel like an afterthought.
Right. And nobody wants to feel like an afterthought. And so you mentioned earlier that I don't see it as an interruption. I absolutely don't. I think that God cares for his people. And I think that his people include my ministry partners, even if they're not my direct ministry focus. They are part of God's people and he cares for them. And so I should care for them also. And I think it ends up being a stewardship issue of how we care for our ministry partners. So I would say invest in the front end. That's the season that we're in right now, is trying to connect with people and just get a good relationship going. I also think that people want to give to people that they know. And if people don't know me, they only know my husband, it kind of makes them only half of it as invested in what we're doing.
Right. Awesome. Well, C, thank you so much for being with me today and for speaking into this topic. I'm thankful for your heart and for your wisdom that you're speaking into this. And it's been a pleasure to have you today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for this episode. We would love to hear your ideas for future content. Please visit supportraisersolutions.org/feedback to share your thoughts and questions. Also, wherever you download your podcasts from, be sure to subscribe for future episodes and come back each week to gain more insight into the process of building and maintaining your personal support team.